Today we are doing section 8.4, day 3. This is our last new section this week. Tomorrow we will review. Thursday we'll take a test. Quiz, test, quest. Somewhere in between a quiz and a test. A long quiz, perhaps. Today we are going to transform equations into slope-intercept form. To warm up, let's identify the slope and y-intercept of each of these equations. So we are identifying slope. Who can tell me what letter we use for slope? Okay, I was looking for hands, but yes, it's M. And who can tell me what letter we use for the y-intercept? Keon. B. And what is slope-intercept form, the general form? Who can tell me that? Deja? Y equals mx plus b. All right. So let's look at number 1. We want to know our slope, or our m, and our y-intercept, the b. Who can tell me what those are? Natalie? Good. And what about B? Wonderful. Slope is 2/3. Our y-intercept is 1. Number 2 is a little tricky, but not too bad. There is still both a slope and a y-intercept. Any volunteers to tell me what they are? Ariana? Our slope is 1. What about our y-intercept? Very good. There's a 1 in front of that x. There is nothing behind the x, so we consider that to be 0. If you want, you can put a plus 0 on the end to visualize that. All right, on number 3. We're looking for our slope and our y-intercept. Jamal? Negative 1/3 for our slope. And what about our y-intercept? -5. Very good. All right, number 4 is a special case. We just talked about it. Who was paying attention? Only Keon was paying attention. Danielle? Our slope is undefined, and what about our y-intercept? There isn't one, none. Very good. So far, the linear equations we have graphed have been in slope-intercept form. Today, we will have to transform the equation to put it into slope-intercept form. All right, so all we are doing is getting y by itself. And we have technically done this before, but we want all of these to look like y equals mx plus b. When we did this before, we didn't necessarily always go all the way to slope-intercept form. Remember I said get y by itself, but if you stay here it's okay, but later on we're going to have to change it around more? Does this ring any bells? This is when we have to change it around a little bit more. So we are trying to get y by itself, but it needs to look like y equals mx plus b. So if I'm trying to get y by itself, what's the first thing that's got to move? The x. Right now that x is positive. How am I going to get it to 0 out? Subtract it. But if I do it to one side, I have to do it to the other side. So this turns into 2y equals, before we were writing it as 14 minus x, and I said that was okay for then. Now is when we have to rewrite it because x has to come first. So we write it as negative x. Is that 14 positive or negative? Positive. So we write plus 14. Questions on the first step? All right. Now what do we need to do to get that y all alone? Ellie? Divide by 2. Normally, we were just putting one big fraction bar with a 2 under it like this, right? But we're going to change that a little bit. We're going to split it up over the addition sign. We're allowed to do that because it's just like having a common denominator in a fraction. So if you want to think about it, this is like an aside, but if you think about it as 1/2 plus 1/2, that's the same as 1 plus 1 all over 2, right? If you have a common denominator, you can write it together or separate. It's the same idea here. We have the same denominator, we're just choosing to split it up. Okay. All right. Then we just have to clean it up a little bit. So we have y equals, y's by itself now. What number is in front of that x? A negative 1, yes, okay. So I'm going to write this as negative 1/2 x. What's 14 divided by 2? 7. So now it's in slope-intercept form. So the things that have changed for us from when we did this before is that we have to write it with the x coming first. And when we divide, we split up our denominator, what we're dividing by, so that we can simplify. Yes, ma'am?
Why don't you get the negative 1/2 or what? Negative half.
So there's a negative 1 in front of the x, and it's getting divided by 2. So I just pulled the x outside of the fraction instead of leaving it in the numerator. If you leave it in the numerator, it's not wrong. It's just harder to see what your slope is. So if you were to write it as negative x over 2 plus 7, that's okay. But sometimes you're also going to have to graph these. So you need to be able to know that that slope is negative 1/2. Other questions? Okay, let's try number 2. Switch colors so we can hopefully see where we're working. All right, on number 2. The first thing that needs to move is the x. To zero out a positive 2x, what do I need to do? Subtract it. If I do it to one side, do it to the other side. That leaves us with 5y equals. Who can raise their hand and tell me how I'm going to write this part? Ryan? That is not how I want to write this part. Carl? Negative 2 plus 2. Negative 2x plus 10. So we have to write it with the x coming first from now on. Okay, the 10 minus 2x is how we would have written it before. And that was okay, but now we need the x to come first if it's going to be in slope-intercept form. Who can tell me what to do next? Maybe someone I haven't heard from yet today. Lexi. Divide everything by 5. So I'm going to divide that side by 5. When I go to the other side, I'm going to split it up and divide both pieces by 5. All right. Now, will the fraction negative 2 over 5 simplify? No, so we're just going to leave it as negative 2/5 x. Will 10 over 5 simplify? What does it become? 2, a positive 2. So now we have the equation in slope-intercept form. Again, if you want to leave the x in the numerator by the negative 2, you can, as long as you know that negative 2/5 is your slope. All right, on number 3. So we do have a subtraction involved here, minus 3y. But let's talk about what that means for us. Still, what's the first thing that has to move? The x. Is the x term positive or negative? Positive. The 5x is positive. So to zero it out, what would we do? Subtract. So we're still subtracting the x term. But when that zeroes out, the 3y still has a minus sign in front of it. You cannot drop that minus sign off the 3y. So this is a negative 3y equals... I need hands. New hands. Kelby, what would I have? What would I have on this side of my equal sign?
Negative 5x minus 12.
Wonderful. Negative 5x minus 12. We still have another step we have to take. Who can raise their hand and tell me my next step? Logan, what should I do next? I'm trying to get y by itself. Right now I'm multiplying it by a negative 3. Divide by a negative 3. But remember, if I do that over here, I also need to do it on the other side. When we go to the other side, we're going to split it up for both terms. I know on the left I'll have just a y. A negative 5 divided by a negative 3. We want to leave it as a fraction, but we know a negative over a negative simplifies to be positive. So we would want to write this as positive 5/3 x. Do not change this to a decimal or a mixed number. Leave it as a fraction. We always want slope as a fraction. Negative 12 divided by negative 3. Anybody? Natalie? A positive 4. Yep, we're dividing on all three of those. Then that's it. We simplified it. We got it in slope-intercept form. Number 4 is a little strange. What's different about it? Keon? Okay, that's what it is. Is there anything we notice that's different about it from the other problems we've done? What, Carl? There's no y there. How are we going to get y by itself if there isn't a y? Well, the answer is that we're not. So really, there's no slope-intercept form for this one. There's no other way to rewrite this other than really to put the negative 3 on the other side, but that doesn't change anything. We cannot put a y in there. There's not a possible way to write that equation with a y. Okay, because what is our slope of this? Ooh. What's the slope of an x equals line? Not 0. Undefined. Slope is undefined. What about a y-intercept on these?
No.
There isn't one. None. Yes, put all this down. I wouldn't ask you for slope-intercept form on this, but if I asked you on this on a notebook quiz, I would expect to see all of this. There's no slope-intercept form because slope is undefined and there is no y-intercept. So if I ask about example 4 on a notebook quiz, that's what I expect to see. On example 5, we've got x minus 7y equals 56. We need it to be in slope-intercept form. Y equals mx plus b. Delaney, what do I need to get rid of first? How am I going to get rid of it? Wonderful. Subtract x. Make sure we do it to both sides. That leaves us with negative 7y equals, Ellie? Close. Negative x plus 56. Keep the sign that's in front of the term. So the x was negative, the 56 is positive. Negative x plus 56. Nevaeh, what's the next thing I need to do?
You need to divide it.
Divide everything by that negative 7. Everything. All 3 pieces straight across. When I do that, I get y equals, a negative over a negative is going to turn positive. What number is technically in front of that x? A 1. So I write this as 1/7 x. A positive 56 divided by a negative 7 is negative 8, so we write it as minus 8. All right, on example 7. First thing I want to do, Jalen. Not just 5, but 5x. Very good. Make sure that you put the x with it, so that way you don't think we can combine these. That leaves us with 3y equals, Jariel, what would that equal?
What?
How would we write this? We subtracted 5x from both sides.
Negative 5x minus 6.
Very good. Negative 5x minus 6. Adrian, what would I do next? Wonderful. When we do that, we get y equals, will this fraction simplify? No, we leave it as negative 5/3 x. Negative 6 divided by 3 is negative 2. All right, one more problem to do all together. Jamaro, what's my first step? Subtract the x from both sides. Y equals, who can tell me how I would write this? May, I think you might be the only person I haven't heard from yet.
Y equals
Negative x minus 3. Wonderful. And then, is there anything else we have to do? No, y is by itself. It's in the form y equals mx plus b. So we can stop. We don't have to divide it. All right, on these, we're just going to give our answers. So I want to just know what you got for your final equation. Any volunteers for number 9? Ellie?
I want y equals 5/6x plus 0.
Good. Do we need the plus 0 on the end? No, we don't. It's okay if you put it because it's nice to remind ourselves what the y-intercept would be. But we don't have to put the plus 0 if we don't want to. So either one of these would work. Very good. Any volunteers for number 10? Keon. Y equals negative 3x plus 2. I would agree with that as well. All we had to do was move the 3x over by subtracting it. And then the y is by itself. It looks like y equals mx plus b. All right, what was our answer on example 11? Tariana? Y equals 7/4 x plus 0. There's one little thing about this that I would change. Jamal, what is it? The 7/4 is negative. I would agree with that. So when we move the 7x over, we would have to subtract it, making it negative. And then we're dividing by a positive 4, so it still would be negative. Again, if you don't want to put the plus 0, you don't have to. You can just write it as negative 7/4 x. Y equals negative 7/4 x. All right, they've got graphs there for us on these. I think that I'd rather get through more examples and practice. Graphing is something we've already practiced a lot. So let's just go on to number 12 for today. If you went ahead and graphed 11 and 12, that's just good for you. All right, Jamal, what was your answer for 12? So our slope is undefined, so that's part of what leads us to what we would say about this one. What else would we need to say? So one of our reasons is that slope is undefined.
No y-intercept.
There's also no y-intercept. That's another reason. Very good. There is no slope-intercept form for these two reasons. No slope-intercept form. We don't have one. There's no y equals mx plus b for that. All right, the last bit of our notes is on that back page. So we should all be flipped over to that back page. All right, almost all of us are there. Here we go. There is another form of equations called standard form. All linear equations in the variables x and y can be written in the form ax plus by equals c, where x and y are on the same side. There are no fractions, and a, the coefficient on the x, is positive. So these three things have to be true. So from the last slide, we know that standard form is ax plus by equals c. So we need x and y to both be on the left. So in order to do that, what am I going to have to do to this equation? Not necessarily. Ellie, what do you think?
3x on both sides.
Good. I want the 3x to join the y. So right now it's a negative 3x. So to get it to zero out, I would add it. But if I do it to one side, gotta do it to the other side. But when we do that, we have to be careful. We want it to be x and then y. So how would I write this as x and then y? Well, is my 3x positive or negative? Positive, so I can write it as 3x. Is that y positive or negative? Positive, so plus y. Equals, what's still remaining on the other side? A 4. Then we just have to double check all three of those rules. So are x and y on the same side? Yes. Are there any fractions? No. Is a, the number in front of x, positive? Yes. So if all of that's true, we've got it in standard form. All right, on 14, what should we do to get this in standard form? Lexi? Subtract x on both sides. We want x and y to be together. When I go to rewrite it, what sign should I have on my x? A negative sign. And what about the y? It's positive, so plus y. Equals -5. So now we run through our rules. Are x and y on the same side? Are there any fractions? Is a positive? No, that's an issue. We got to change that. So if I change the sign on my x, I have to change every single other sign the whole way through. So if I flip x to be positive, what happens to y? It becomes a negative y or a minus y. And what happens to the -5? It becomes a positive 5. So if you change one sign, you got to change them all. Now we've got it in standard form. Questions about 13 or 14? All right, we've got a couple more. First thing to do to get it into standard form. Jamal? We want to move the x over, so we're going to add the 4/5 x to both sides. When I add it to the left, the sign on both the x term and the y, they're both positive, so I can just write it as 4/5 x plus y. What do I still have on this side? A 6. All right, are x and y on the same side? Are there fractions? Yes, that's a problem. We don't want fractions. So we are going to multiply the whole thing by the denominator. So we multiply every single thing by 5. That's going to get rid of our fraction for us. If we multiply 4/5 by 5, the 5's reduce and we're left with what? A 4. So this becomes 4x plus 5 times y is 5y equals 5 times 6. All right, so then x and y are on the same side. There are no fractions. Is a positive? Yes, so we can be done there. On number 16, what do I need to do? Subtract 2/3 x. The sign on the x term is negative. What about on the 2y? The 2y
Positive.
is positive. What's left on the other side? A -1. Now we've got two issues. A is negative and there's a fraction. If you want to deal with those one thing at a time, you can, or you can deal with it all at once. So I'm going to choose to multiply through by what number? 3, but in order to change all my signs, I'll make it a negative 3. So this will multiply by 3 and change the signs at the same time. So here, the 3's are going to reduce, the negatives cancel to a positive, so I'm left with, not 6, the 3's cancel each other. Regular 2. If you take negative 3 times negative 2/3, that's a positive 6 divided by 3. That's how we get the 2. Or you can think about the 3's canceling each other out. So we have a positive 2x. Negative 3 times positive 2 is negative 6y. Negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 1 is a positive 3. There we go. It's in standard form.